The morning sun cast long shadows across the military base as Colonel Thomas Anderson straightened his tie in the mirror. 25 years of service had taught him that details mattered, especially on days like this. His fingers traced the ribbons on his chest, each one telling a story of sacrifice, courage, and dedication to his country. The weight of today's mission pressed heavily on his shoulders, escorting a fallen soldier home to their final resting place. As he adjusted his uniform one last time, his mind wandered to the young private he would be accompanying. Just 19 years old, taken too soon in a foreign land. Anderson had done this duty before, but it never got easier. Each time, he saw the faces of his own children, thought about the families waiting at home, hoping against hope that they'd never receive that dreaded call. The base commander had personally selected Anderson for this mission, knowing his reputation for handling these sensitive situations with grace and dignity. "You're one of our best, Colonel," the commander had said, handing over the official orders. "Make sure our hero gets home with the honor they deserve." In his office, Anderson carefully packed his briefcase with the necessary documentation: death certificate, transfer papers, military orders, all meticulously organized. His assistant, Lieutenant Chen, knocked softly on the doorframe. "Sir, the transport to the airport is ready." The drive to the airport was quiet, the morning traffic parting respectfully around their military vehicle. Anderson used this time to mentally prepare himself for the journey ahead. He thought about the family waiting at the other end, parents who had sent their child off to serve their country, never imagining they'd return this way. He pulled out their photo from the file, studying their faces, knowing that in a few hours he would be looking into their eyes, trying to offer what comfort he could. The airport came into view, its massive terminals gleaming in the morning light. Anderson checked his watch. They were right on schedule. As they pulled up to the military reception area, he could see the ground crew preparing for the transfer. The fallen soldier's transfer case would be handled with utmost respect, every movement choreographed to honor their sacrifice. Lieutenant Chen helped gather the paperwork as Anderson stepped out of the vehicle. The cool morning air carried the distant sound of jets taking off, a reminder of the long journey ahead. Airport staff nodded respectfully as he passed, many stopping what they were doing to stand at attention. This was the part of military tradition that Anderson held most sacred, the unspoken understanding that transcended rank and position, the shared respect for those who had given everything for their country. As he walked through the terminal, Anderson's polished shoes clicked against the floor, drawing glances from civilian travelers. Some stopped to watch him pass, instinctively understanding that they were witnessing something important. Children tugged at their parents' sleeves, asking questions in hushed voices. Anderson maintained his bearing, eyes forward, embodying the dignity of his mission. He approached the airline counter, orders in hand, ready to begin the next phase of this solemn duty. The morning sun now streamed through the terminal's high windows, and Anderson said a silent prayer, not just for the fallen soldier he would accompany, but for all those who had made the ultimate sacrifice. Little did he know that this routine mission was about to become something much more significant, a moment that would test not just his patience and professionalism, but the very principles he had sworn to uphold. The bustling airport terminal buzzed with its usual morning energy, but something was about to disturb its rhythm. Colonel Anderson approached the check-in counter, his carefully pressed uniform drawing respectful glances from passing travelers. The weight of his mission, escorting a fallen soldier home, showed in his measured steps and serious expression. "Good morning," he said, sliding his military orders and ID across the counter. "I'm escorting a fallen service member today." The gate agent barely glanced at his documentation before pushing it back. "There seem to be some irregularities with your paperwork, sir," she said, her tone carrying an edge that made several nearby passengers look up from their phones. Anderson kept his voice steady, drawing from years of military discipline. "Ma'am, I assure you these orders are complete and properly authorized. Perhaps you could point out the specific issue." He thought about the grieving family waiting at their destination, counting on him to bring their loved one home. Behind him, Other military personnel moved through the boarding process without a second glance. A young white lieutenant nodded respectfully as he passed, his own papers receiving just a cursory check before he was waved through. The contrast wasn't lost on the growing crowd of onlookers. "I'll need to call my supervisor," the agent announced, picking up her phone while keeping her eyes fixed on Anderson's medals and ribbons, as if questioning their authenticity. The colonel stood straight, his hands clasped behind his back in parade rest, the stance as natural to him as breathing after 25 years of service. A businessman in line spoke up. "He's a colonel, for heaven's sake, and he's escorting a fallen soldier." Others began to murmur in agreement. Anderson raised a hand slightly, silently asking for calm. This wasn't about him. It was about getting a fallen hero home to their family. The supervisor arrived, his name tag catching the fluorescent light. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, directing the question to his employee rather than the colonel. Anderson could feel his phone vibrating in his pocket, probably Lieutenant Chen, checking on the status of the transfer case in the cargo area. "Sir," Anderson began, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had earned him respect throughout his career, "I have a sacred duty to perform today. Every minute we delay is a minute that family has to wait to receive their loved one." He gestured to his orders again. "Everything is in order. I've done this duty before." Passengers had started recording the scene on their phones, their expressions a mix of disbelief and anger. A retired veteran in a Vietnam War cap stood nearby, shaking his head in disgust. The terminal's usual sounds seemed to fade away as more people stopped to watch the scene unfold. The supervisor picked up the papers, making a show of examining each page, while other flights continued boarding around them. Through the windows, Anderson could see the planes taking off, each one a reminder of precious time being wasted. He thought about the transfer case in the cargo area, a young life ended too soon, waiting to complete their final journey home. "Perhaps we should call the military liaison office," the supervisor suggested, reaching for the phone. Anderson's jaw tightened slightly, the only outward sign of his growing frustration. He'd served his country for over 2 decades, led troops in combat, earned every ribbon and medal on his chest, and now stood being questioned about his right to perform this most solemn of duties. A young mother waiting in line pulled her curious child closer, whispering something that made the little one's eyes go wide as they looked at Anderson's uniform. Even at that age, children could sense when something wasn't right. The colonel gave the child a gentle smile, remembering that even in difficult moments, he represented something larger than himself, the honor and dignity of military service. The situation at the gate had evolved from a simple delay into something much more concerning. Colonel Anderson stood firm, his military bearing unchanged despite the growing tension. Around him, the terminal had become unusually quiet, with passengers pausing their rushed airport routines to witness what was unfolding. "I need to speak with your station manager," Anderson said, his voice carrying the same calm authority he'd used to lead troops through combat zones. This has gone beyond a simple documentation check. He could see his own reflection in the terminal windows, the same proud uniform he'd worn for ceremonies, for deployments, for countless moments of both triumph and sorrow. The supervisor's radio crackled with voices, adding to the tension. More airline staff gathered behind the counter, whispering among themselves. A flight attendant from another gate walked over, concern evident on her face. "That transfer case in cargo, it's a fallen soldier?" she asked quietly. When Anderson nodded, she pressed her lips together and walked briskly toward the airline's offices. Phones continued recording the scene, their small red lights blinking like silent witnesses. An elderly couple who had been waiting for their flight stood up and moved closer. The old man wore a Korean War veteran's cap, and he caught Anderson's eye with a look of understanding that spanned generations of military service. "My grandson serves," the elderly veteran said, his voice carrying in the hushed terminal. He'd be ashamed to see this happening to a superior officer. Others nodded in agreement, the crowd growing larger as word spread through the terminal about what was taking place. A young airport employee approached with a tablet, showing something to the supervisor. On the screen, Anderson could see military protocols clearly outlined for handling escort duties. The supervisor's face tightened as he read, perhaps realizing the gravity of their mistake. But instead of immediately correcting course, he stepped away to make another phone call. Lieutenant Chen appeared at the end of the terminal, worry evident on his face as he took in the scene. Anderson gave him a subtle hand signal. "Stay back. Let this play out." They both knew that every minute wasted here was another minute of anxiety for the waiting family. The terminal's regular announcements continued overhead, a strange contrast to the tense scene below. Final boarding call for Flight 2317 to Denver. The same flight Anderson was supposed to be on, the one carrying precious cargo that deserved so much more respect than it was currently receiving. A group of soldiers from another unit, waiting for their own flight, stood at attention when they recognized what was happening. Their silent support spoke volumes, bridging gaps of rank and race with the shared understanding of service and sacrifice. Through it all, Anderson maintained his composure, though his thoughts turned to the fallen soldier he was escorting. Would they have faced the same treatment if they were still alive? The question burned in his mind, but his expression revealed nothing. Years of military discipline had taught him that sometimes the strongest response was simply standing your ground. "Sir," a new voice cut through the tension. A different airline representative approached, this one wearing a senior management badge. "I just spoke with our regional director." She paused, looking at the scene around her. The recording phones, the gathered crowd, the veterans standing in silent support. "We need to discuss this situation immediately." Anderson checked his watch again, thinking of that flag-draped transfer case waiting in the cargo area. Time was slipping away, but more than just a schedule was at stake now. This moment had become about something larger, about respect, about dignity, about the promises we make to those who serve our country, regardless of who they are or what they look like. The crowd had grown so large that other gates were affected, passengers straining to see what was happening. In this modern age of instant communication, Anderson knew that this scene was already spreading beyond the airport's walls, becoming part of a larger conversation that America needed to have. Within hours of the airport incident, cell phone videos began spreading across the internet like wildfire. The first clip appeared on social media at 10:47 a.m., a shaky recording showing Colonel Anderson standing tall in his decorated uniform, calmly explaining his mission while being denied boarding. By noon, it had been shared over 50,000 times. The comment sections exploded with reactions. "This is how they treat our military," wrote one viewer, their words echoed by thousands. Veterans groups shared the video, adding their own stories of similar experiences. The footage showed every detail: the gleaming medals on Anderson's chest, the respectful way he handled himself, the growing crowd of supporters, and the stark contrast of other military personnel boarding without issue. News networks picked up the story by early afternoon. The headlines varied but carried the same message. Decorated colonel delayed while escorting fallen soldier. Military escort faces discrimination at major airport. Viral video shows colonel's dignified response to prejudice. Each report included clips from different angles, captured by various passengers who felt compelled to document the incident. In their living room, the fallen soldiers' parents watched the unfolding coverage with tears in their eyes. They had been waiting at their local airport, wondering about the delay when the news reached them. Their son's final journey home had become tangled in something much larger than they could have imagined. The father, himself a veteran, sat silently gripping his wife's hand as reporters discussed the incident. Military support groups began organizing within hours. A retired general appeared on a news broadcast, his voice shaking with controlled anger as he explained the sacred duty of escorting fallen soldiers home. "This isn't just about one colonel," he said. "This is about respect for our fallen, respect for our military, and respect for each other as Americans." The airline's social media team struggled to keep up with the flood of comments. Their initial response, a brief statement about following standard procedures, only fueled the outrage. Military families shared their own experiences of losing loved ones, explaining the importance of the escort's role in bringing them home. Each story added another layer of humanity to the viral moment. Veterans from different eras began sharing their stories online. A Vietnam veteran posted about facing similar treatment decades ago. A young active duty soldier shared how Colonel Anderson had once been her commanding officer, describing his leadership and character. These personal accounts transformed the incident from a viral video into a powerful conversation about respect, service, and dignity. By evening, the airport security camera's footage had also emerged, showing the full 97 minutes that Colonel Anderson stood his ground. The silent black and white video captured something the cell phone recordings missed: the quiet dignity of a soldier refusing to let disrespect delay his sacred duty. Viewers noted how he checked his watch repeatedly, thinking not of himself but of the family waiting for their loved one. Military advocacy groups began calling for accountability. They highlighted regulations about military escorts, particularly those accompanying fallen service members. The airline's policy manual was shared online, showing clear guidelines for handling military transport, guidelines that had been ignored that morning. The most powerful posts came from other military escorts, sharing their experiences of bringing fallen heroes home to their families. They explained the weight of the responsibility, the importance of timing, the sacred trust placed in them by grieving families. These stories helped people understand why Colonel Anderson had stood so firm, why every minute of delay mattered. Local veterans began gathering at the airline's headquarters, standing in silent protest. They didn't carry signs or shout slogans. They simply stood at attention, some in old uniforms, others wearing veteran caps. Their quiet presence spoke volumes, drawing even more attention to the story. The airline's first press conference only made things worse. Their spokesperson stood at the podium, reading from a prepared statement about following standard security protocols and ensuring passenger safety. The words rang hollow against the backdrop of viral videos showing Colonel Anderson's dignified bearing and proper documentation. Behind the scenes, phones were ringing nonstop at the airline's headquarters. Military officials demanded explanations. Congressional representatives called for investigations. The Department of Defense released a stern statement reminding everyone about the protocols for military escorts, especially those accompanying fallen service members. The fallen soldier's mother finally spoke to the press, her voice steady despite her pain. "My son gave his life for this country," she said, sitting in her living room surrounded by family photos. "All we wanted was to bring him home with dignity. Colonel Anderson was doing his duty. Why couldn't they let him do it?" Her words cut through all the corporate statements and legal language, reaching straight to people's hearts. Veterans continued gathering outside airline offices across the country. They came in wheelchairs with canes, some wearing uniforms that barely fit after decades. Young active duty service members joined them during off-duty hours, standing in respectful silence. News cameras captured the powerful image. Military members from different generations, united in their call for respect and dignity. Inside the airline's boardroom, executives faced a crisis. Their stock price was dropping. Customers were canceling flights. Military organizations were speaking the boycotts. The initial response, crafted by their legal team, had only fueled the fire. Now they needed to do more than just manage public relations. They needed to acknowledge a deep failure. Colonel Anderson received invitation after invitation to appear on news shows, but he declined them all. His focus remained on his duty, ensuring the fallen soldier reached home with proper honors. This quiet dedication spoke louder than any interview could have, showing exactly why he had stood his ground at that airport gate. Military families began sharing their own stories of bringing loved ones home. One widow described how her husband's escort had stayed with her throughout the journey, ensuring every detail was handled with respect. A father talked about the comfort of knowing his daughter's final trip home was guided by someone who understood the sacrifice. These personal stories transformed the incident from a viral moment into a movement for change. The airline's board of directors called an emergency meeting. The public's reaction had made it clear. This wasn't just about one incident or one colonel. This was about respect for service members, about honoring fallen heroes, about treating everyone with dignity regardless of their appearance. Their carefully worded statements weren't fixing anything. Letters and emails poured in from around the world. A British Royal Air Force officer wrote about similar experiences. Canadian veterans shared messages of support. The story had touched something universal, the basic human right to be treated with respect while performing sacred duties. The fallen soldier's hometown prepared for his arrival. American flags lined the streets. People stood in their yards, hands over hearts, as the procession finally passed. Colonel Anderson's delayed escort mission had become a symbol of something larger. But for the family, it was still about bringing their loved one home. Through it all, military support groups kept sharing one simple message. This wasn't an isolated incident. They provided statistics, shared stories, and demanded real change. The airline's response would need to be more than just another corporate apology. It would need to show genuine understanding and commitment to transformation. 3 weeks after the incident, the airline's CEO stepped into a packed conference room. The wall of cameras and microphones captured his unscripted apology. "We failed," he began, his voice carrying the weight of genuine regret. "We failed Colonel Anderson. We failed our fallen hero. We failed that grieving family. And we failed every service member who puts on a uniform." The internal investigation revealed uncomfortable truths. This wasn't just about one gate agent or supervisor. The investigators found a pattern of similar incidents that had gone unreported or been dismissed. Training materials were outdated. Complaints had been filed away and forgotten. The airline had to face the fact that their problem went deeper than one bad day at one airport gate. The Department of Transportation's findings came next. Their report detailed multiple violations of federal regulations regarding military escorts and discriminatory practices. The fine they levied was the largest in the department's history. But more importantly, they demanded systemic changes in how airlines handle military personnel, especially those performing escort duties. The gate agent and supervisor from the incident were let go, but the airline didn't stop there. They launched a complete overhaul of their training programs. Military veterans were brought in to help design new protocols. Every employee, from baggage handlers to executives, would need to complete updated training on military escort procedures and anti-discrimination policies. During a congressional hearing, Colonel Anderson finally spoke publicly about the incident. He didn't talk about himself or the disrespect he faced. Instead, he spoke about the fallen soldier he was escorting, about the sacred duty of bringing heroes home, about the families who wait for their loved one's final return. His testimony brought tears to the eyes of hardened politicians. The airline's new policies became a model for the industry. Priority boarding for military escorts became standard. Special check-in procedures were implemented. Staff received regular training from military liaison officers. Other airlines began adopting similar changes, not waiting to learn the hard way. Veterans groups monitored the changes closely. They conducted test runs, sending military members through airports to ensure the new procedures were being followed. The results showed improvement, but they kept watching. This wasn't about punishing one airline. It was about changing an entire system. The gate agent who had stopped Colonel Anderson wrote a public letter of apology. She described how the incident forced her to confront her own biases, how she had failed to see the person behind the uniform. Her honest self-reflection added another layer to the ongoing national conversation about respect and dignity. Military families shared stories of their experiences after the changes. A young lieutenant described the difference in how she was treated while escorting a fallen comrade. A retired sergeant major talked about seeing airline staff stand at attention as a transfer case passed by. Small changes, but meaningful ones. The airline created a new position, Military and Veterans Services Director. They hired a retired colonel to fill it, giving him authority to oversee all military-related policies and procedures. His first act was to establish a direct line of communication between the airline and military escort services. The fallen soldiers' parents were invited to speak at the airline's employee training sessions. They shared their perspective on why every moment matters when bringing a hero home. Their words became part of the permanent training program, reminding every employee of the real human impact of their actions. Through it all, Colonel Anderson maintained his dignity and focus. When asked about the changes his stand had sparked, he simply said, "Sometimes doing your duty means standing firm, even when it's difficult. This was never about me. It was about respect for our fallen heroes and their families." 1 year after the incident, Colonel Anderson stood in front of a mirror again, adjusting a different uniform. The single star of a brigadier general now rested on his shoulders, but his thoughts weren't on his promotion. They were on the changes he'd seen over the past year, and the work still ahead. The airline industry had transformed its approach to military personnel. At airports across the country, new signs directed service members to dedicated check-in areas. Military escorts received priority treatment, especially those accompanying fallen heroes. The sight of airline staff standing at attention as transfer cases passed by had become common practice, not just policy. The changes went beyond airports. Other industries began examining their own practices. Hotels updated their policies for military families. Car rental companies created special programs for service members. The ripple effects touched every corner of the service community, creating a new standard of respect and understanding. In military circles, the incident became a teaching moment. Officer training programs now included discussions about standing firm in the face of discrimination while maintaining professionalism. Young lieutenants studied how one officer's dignified response had sparked nationwide change. But they also learned that change only matters if it lasts. The fallen soldier's family had become advocates in their own right. Their quiet strength touched hearts across the nation as they spoke about dignity, respect, and the true meaning of service. They worked with veterans groups to ensure other families wouldn't face similar situations during their darkest hours. Training programs developed after the incident spread throughout the transportation industry. Airport staff learned about military customs and traditions. They heard firsthand accounts from Gold Star families about the importance of treating fallen heroes and their escorts with respect. These weren't just rules to follow. They were lessons in human dignity. The airline's Military and Veterans Services Office became a model for corporate America. Other companies sought advice on creating similar positions. The retired colonel who ran it often said, "We learned the hard way, but we learned well." His office didn't just handle complaints, it actively worked to prevent them. General Anderson's promotion ceremony was attended by some unexpected guests. The elderly veteran who had stood by him at the airport came with his grandson, now a newly commissioned officer. They represented the passing of wisdom between generations, the importance of standing up for what's right. At military bases across the country, escort duty was no longer seen as just another assignment. It was recognized as one of the highest honors, bringing fallen heroes home to their families with dignity and respect. The changes sparked by one colonel's stand had elevated the entire mission. A new memorial wall at the airline's headquarters displayed photos of fallen service members who had traveled their final journey home. Below them, a simple inscription read, "Every hero deserves honor. Every family deserves respect." It served as a daily reminder to everyone who passed by. In his new office, General Anderson kept a simple framed photo, not of the incident or its aftermath, but of a flag-draped transfer case being carried with full honors through an airport terminal. For him, that image captured what the whole thing had been about, ensuring every fallen hero received the dignity they deserved. As he prepared for his first day as general, Anderson thought about all the young service members watching him. His stand hadn't just been about one moment or one fallen soldier. It had been about setting an example of dignity, courage, and respect that would guide future generations.